You said babies were put in ovens on 7th of October. Why lie like that? You know that's a lie.
I'm not lying.
You know that never
I'm not
happened.
lying.
You know that never happened. You know not a single baby, one baby,
There's
which was a crime. Let me finish.
No. Of it.
You had a long spiel, and now I'm going to fact correct you because you can't just come on a show like this.
You don't do facts.
I know Pierce likes accuracy.
There is a difference between condemning Hamas for what happened on October 7th and repeating every claim made about that attack as fact. And in this debate, that distinction becomes very important. Josh Hammer is about to make a very specific claim about what happened to babies on October 7th. Owen Jones immediately challenges him on it. But the argument doesn't stop there, because once that claim is challenged, the debate moves into an even bigger question. What was Israel justified in doing after October 7th? And that's where this conversation gets much more complicated. We're going to hear the argument exactly as it happened, then look at the evidence behind the claims being made. If you want political commentary that doesn't just repeat talking points, subscribe to The Honest Perspective. I'm Neil. This is The Honest Perspective. We follow the receipts, even when they're uncomfortable. Let's get into it.
Lest we forget, there was a ceasefire, a full ceasefire in Gaza on October 6, 2023. What happened on October 7th was the equivalent of dozens of 9/11s. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary of 9/11. I remember it very well. I grew up in the New York area. I remember vividly seeing the smoke from the Twin Towers on that most fateful of days. What happened on October 7th was the functional equivalent on the death toll of dozens of 9/11s on American soil. The median American watching this program should ask him or herself, if this had happened in, let's call it Texas, if you had thousands of Sinaloa cartel commanders who came across the border and just blindly mutilated and raped and butchered. They put babies in ovens. They executed women point blank range on their home. How would the United States respond? How would we respond? These are the kind of questions that have gone so far removed from this debate. And no matter how many fancy words like genocide get perversely and morally incorrectly and legally incorrectly tossed around, I think it's incumbent upon all the reasonable people to ground themselves in the basic facts. And Owen Jones can laugh his sorry ass off who he wants. No one in their right mind really ought to give a crap.
Can I just respond to something you've just... Well, I'll respond if you let me to what you just said there.
And right there is where we need to be precise. Nobody needs to invent atrocities to establish that October 7th was horrific. Hamas attacked civilians. People were murdered. People were taken hostage. Those crimes deserve condemnation. But that doesn't mean every individual story repeated about October 7th automatically becomes true. If someone makes a specific factual claim, the standard should be simple. Did it happen or didn't it? Because once a dramatic claim becomes part of the political narrative, people can start repeating it without ever checking where it came from. And that's exactly why Owen's response is important. He's not arguing that October 7th didn't happen. He's challenging this particular claim. Let's hear what he says.
You just said babies were put in ovens on 7th of October. Why lie like that? You know that's a lie.
I'm not lying.
You know that never happened.
Lying.
You know that never happened. You know not a single baby, one baby, which was a crime. Let me finish. No. You had a long spiel, and now I'm going to fact correct you because you can't just come on a show like this.
You don't do facts.
I know Pierce likes accuracy. I know he likes accuracy in these discussions. No babies were put in an oven on 7th of October. One baby was killed on October 7th, which was bad enough. That's Mila Cohen. She was 8 months old. She was shot through the door of a safe room. That's the baby who was killed on 7th of October. That's a crime in itself. If that's a crime, which I say it is, by the way, how to describe 1,000 babies, 1,000 infants under the age of 1 killed in Gaza by Israel since 7th of October, and over 20,000 children. Now, just to respond to what you just said about genocide, I understand that you're a big fan of Donald Trump. I don't often quote Donald Trump approvingly, let's put it mildly. Last year, he said, and I quote, "A civilization has been wiped out in Gaza." Now, if I were to demand that a civilization was wiped out in Israel.
He didn't say it. He was threatening Iran prior to the ceasefire in April. He was talking about Iran, not Gaza.
Again,
that's not...
I'm sorry,
you're totally wrong.
I'm sorry to fact correct you again, but he did say, quote, this is a verbatim quote, he said a civilization has been wiped out in Gaza, and he's absolutely right. Nearly every freestanding structure is damaged or destroyed.
Persia, Iran,
almost every hospital has been attacked, every school's been attacked, most homes have been destroyed. Well over 100,000 people have been violently killed, according to every reputable study.
Also not true.
A
It's
genocide,
closer to
according to the
50,
Genocide
60,000, 70
Convention,
most.
it means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group.
And
that
that
includes
definition
deliberately
fails.
inflicting
There's no
on the group
intent
conditions
to
of life
obliterate all of
calculated
the
to bring
Arabs
about
of
its
Gaza.
physical
There's
destruction
no intent.
in
It
whole or in
fails on its
part.
own terms.
Now, I would just note
this
quickly...
is so obvious.
Okay, I would just note with you, because you are a supporter of genocide, and I will make that very clear.
I am not.
You said about the Palestinian population of Gaza. You said this is a radicalised population that deserves shame, scorn, and diplomatic rebuke. You weren't talking about Hamas.
They deserve
You
all
talked
that.
about the Palestinian population of Gaza. That's what you said. You also said large swathes of Gaza should resemble a
planet Earth
parking
according
lot
to every
in
single
October
puzzle
2023.
metric.
You also called for the population transfer of the people, the survivors of Gaza, into other Arab states. You want Palestinians removed from Gaza. You don't want Palestinians to remain in Gaza. That's what you called for. You also
never
called for the
explicitly
military
called for that,
occupation
but I think it's a perfectly
or formal
reasonable option. By the way,
re-annexation
Donald
of
Trump also
Gaza.
publicly
That's what
floated
you
in
also
February
said.
2025.
Did you say that?
I never actually personally
did you,
came out emphatically in favor of that, though. That's simply not true.
Did you?
Now the argument has changed. We're no longer just talking about what happened on October 7th. We're talking about what Israel did after October 7th. And this is where the two sides are making fundamentally different arguments. Hammer's position is essentially that Israel was responding to an enormous terrorist attack and that its military campaign has been comparatively restrained. Owen's argument is that Israel had a right to defend itself, but that right did not make the subsequent destruction of Gaza automatically justified. That distinction matters, because the question isn't simply, did Israel have a right to respond? The question is, were the methods and scale of that response lawful and proportionate? And that's exactly where the next section takes us.
Single largest genocide of Jews in a day since Hitler was alive. What would you have advised them to do? Because from my perspective, they've done a pretty darn good job. Has it been perfect? No. Have there been blunders?
Well, let me give you the nearest.
But
let me answer. I've said this before, and it's not an exact parallel. I accept it. However, we had for many decades the issue with Northern Ireland and the troubles with the UK. And I remember the IRA, a terrorist organisation, committing appalling atrocities, deliberately killing civilians without any pretense of going after the enemy, as well as killing people they viewed as the enemy, like the British Army and so on. But they did this for many decades. And at no point did any British government take a view that the way to resolve this and the way to respond was to carpet bomb parts of Belfast, for example. So we had a parallel right on our doorstep involving
no carpet
a
bombing in
border,
Gaza.
involving a clash between... Well, listen, here's what I would say about Gaza. And I've said this repeatedly. Because hang on, Josh, I've always defended, as you know, Israel's right to defend itself. I did so passionately after October the 7th. I got hammered by people on the pro-Palestinian side for doing so. But I stand by what I said for many months after the start of the response to October the 7th. But I began quite quickly to say, what is proportionate? What is proportionate here? And actually, ultimately, I concluded that raising 80% of Gaza to the ground, making it uninhabitable, killing 80,000 or so people in Gaza as a response to the appalling killing in a terrorist attack.
A mass percentage of whom are Hamas combatants,
people.
lest we forget.
But let me finish my point, Owen, is that actually, to me, it's been completely disproportionate. And as, by the way, that's the view of most of the world,
so
which is
we
why
know the international law
Israel
of proportionality
reputation
here on this show.
Let me finish my point. I'll finish my point. That is why Israel's reputation has been dragged further down and further down by the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, which contains people that I think are genuine psychopaths like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So that is my view about it.
Just quickly on Dresden, by the way. Dresden was a terrible crime in its own right, and there were people in Britain at the time who opposed what happened to Dresden. Nonetheless, there is no comparison here. Nazi Germany was a military superpower that had conquered Europe and had slaughtered tens of millions of people and committed an industrialised genocide and was attempting to, quite plausibly at the time, achieve world domination. Gaza is the size of East London. It is a tiny, overpopulated strip of land with a ragtag guerrilla army, and it has been wiped out from the face of the earth deliberately and systematically. And what you just said there, Piers, I think is very important. You said it's been made uninhabitable. Again, I quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction wholly in part. That's what genocide does. It makes.
That's not
it's about
true.
In Gaza has been made
that is not
an
what
uninhabitable place.
That
well, you support that though, but you support removing the Palestinian population. You supported that. You supported
your
as a
definition earlier literally said that there is the specific intent. Okay.
Yes.
So in legal terms, we would say the mens rea, the specific mentality to intend to annihilate a certain population from the face of the earth. How is that possible? Where the civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza is literally 1 to 1.5. It is not a lie. It is the most humane civilian to combatant death ratio in the modern history of urban warfare. How do I know that? Because the literal #1 Western world expert in urban warfare, John Spencer, who I believe has been on this show before, he has cranked the numbers on this. And who is going to dispute? Is Owen Jones going to dispute Professor John Spencer? Really?
If you want to go there, do you really want to go there?
Do you really want to go there? Numbers?
Do you really want to go there?
Saying that there's a subjective intentionality to annihilate a population from the face of the earth with.
You've made a point there about deferring to authority. We'll defer to authority, all right, but we'll defer to authority. Who to listen to? A blowhard like yourself who's lucky to get, I looked, about 300 views on your YouTube channel per video, or Professor Omar Bartov, the Israeli-American Dean's Professor of Holocaust Study at Brown University. He said, I'm a genocide scholar, I'm a scholar of the Holocaust, I know a genocide. Well,
okay, so what about Amos Goldberg? Named one very left-wing Israeli natural professor.
I will finish, and then you can respond.
I guess.
Amos Goldberg, Professor of Holocaust History at the Department of Jewish Study and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Daniel Blattman, again, head of the Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Raz Sigal, Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. All of these are Israeli. All of these born in Israel, and all of these dedicate their whole lives to studying genocide and the Holocaust.
They're wrong.
Who
They're
to believe?
Wrong.
Scholars who dedicate their lives to studying genocide.
And by the way,
to studying
you and
the
Piers
Holocaust,
are both wrong on your understanding, your misunderstanding.
Yeah, but hang on. All right, Josh, hang on, Josh. The point surely is this: is that you can say they're wrong. But Owen is right, surely, to point out that a number of Israeli scholars have concluded that what's been happening in Gaza is genocide.
And this is where I think the debate deserves a little more scrutiny, because there are actually two things that can be true at the same time. October 7th was horrific, and Israel's response can still be examined and criticized. Those positions are not contradictory. Hamas's attack on civilians does not disappear because we're discussing Gaza. But Gaza's destruction doesn't disappear because we're discussing October 7th either. The mistake is pretending that one automatically settles the other. Now, the babies in ovens claim is a perfect example of why factual accuracy matters. A horrific event does not need additional unverified details to make it horrific. If civilians were murdered, say that. If hostages were taken, document it. If a particular atrocity happened, show the evidence. But if a specific story didn't happen, it shouldn't be repeated simply because it produces a powerful emotional reaction. That standard should apply to every side. And the same principle applies to the genocide debate. Calling something genocide is not simply saying that a large number of civilians died. There is a specific legal standard involving prohibited acts and, critically, the question of intent. That means this isn't a debate that should be settled by shouting genocide or not genocide louder than the other person. The evidence has to be examined. And that's where the civilian casualty argument becomes important. Hammer points to a civilian to combatant ratio and argues that it demonstrates Israel has conducted the war with unusual restraint. But a statistic like that requires us to ask, how were those people classified? Who was counted as a combatant? Who was counted as a civilian? How were unidentified bodies classified? What methodology was used? And who independently verified the classifications? Because changing the underlying classification can completely change the ratio. That doesn't automatically prove the ratio is false. It means the ratio cannot be treated as self-proving evidence. And the same standard applies to Owen's claims. If he says a particular number of civilians were killed, or that particular Israeli scholars believe genocide occurred, those claims should also be checked against reliable sources. That's what serious commentary should look like, not picking a side first and then searching for evidence afterward. Start with the evidence, then follow it wherever it leads. And there is another important point from this debate. Hammer argues that Israel's objective is Hamas, not the Palestinian population. That's a meaningful distinction. A military campaign against an armed group is not automatically genocide simply because civilians die. But the existence of a military objective also doesn't automatically excuse every action taken in pursuit of it. That's why proportionality, distinction, precautions, targeting practices, humanitarian access, and the treatment of civilians all matter. The question is not whether Israel was allowed to fight Hamas. The question is how Israel fought Hamas and what happened to the civilian population in the process. And that is a question that deserves serious investigation rather than political slogans. But there's something else I want to point out. Notice how quickly the conversation moves from evidence to identity. One person invokes October 7th. The other invokes Gaza. One side says, look what Hamas did. The other says, look what Israel did. And both can become ways of avoiding the uncomfortable evidence sitting directly in front of them. That's exactly what we should resist. You don't have to defend Hamas to care about Palestinian civilians. You don't have to support the Israeli government's policies to care about Israeli civilians. You don't have to choose between condemning anti-Semitism and condemning the Israeli government's conduct. And you don't have to choose between recognizing October 7th and recognizing Palestinian suffering. A serious position can hold all of those things together. Because human rights aren't supposed to depend on which flag is involved.